Good morning, Mercy Vineyard. My name is Edward Jefferson, and I've been blessed with the opportunity this morning to preach our second sermon in our series entitled Redeemed Villains. If you know anything about me, I really enjoy anything in the genre of like superheroes and supervillains. You know, when I was younger, my dad, he had a box of Fantastic Four comics. And I remember we would read them and then we, sketch them. And he was an artist. He would, do some sketching and some tracing and stuff. And that was kind of my first introduction to this world of like superheroes and supervillains. I'm a 80s baby, late 80s baby, grew up in the 90s, watching a lot of the great TV shows like Batman, the animated series, or X-Men, the animated series, cartoons like Sailor Moon for you anime fans. Power Rangers, all these different shows where, we actually had commercials we had to sit through before streaming took over. So when I think of a redeemed villain, and specifically we're talking about the second person in our series, we're going to be talking about Moses this morning. But I think when we think of villains, some of the most long-standing and most memorable villains that we have in media are the ones that really kind of tug on your heartstrings. Where their backstory is sad, and it kind of you wish they didn't turn out the way that they did. You kind of see why they maybe went on a path of villainy. There's a superhero or supervillain trope that's out there called the tragic villain, and a tragic villain is an evil character whose actions are at least partly explained by having a very sad backstory. Maybe a former hero was forced to commit a necessary evil, and maybe some occasional villainy, thinking that they were doing good, but they had to do some sort of a villainous act in order to achieve their goal. They had good intent behind it. But a lot of the times, these villains end up turning to the dark side, or they feel like they're beyond hope or they're beyond redemption because of the bad things that they did to try to achieve their goals. I'm thinking about somebody like Anakin Skywalker, who we also know turns into Darth Vader. I got a little thing I want to read here for you about Anakin Skywalker, if you're not familiar with the Star Wars series. The plight of Anakin Skywalker and the wrath of Darth Vader is told across 6 Star Wars movies. Anakin is born into slavery on Tatooine, and he was rescued by Qui-Gon Jinn, who insisted on Anakin becoming a Jedi even when the Jedi Council said he was too old. Later, he blames himself for leaving his mother, and his mother ends up getting kidnapped, and he ends up having to avenge his mother's death by killing and slaughtering the Tusken Raiders. And he's a Jedi, and the Jedi, they're the good guys, and Anakin's training to be a Jedi, but he has this situation that really pushes him and is kind of instrumental in turning him to the dark side. I mean, how can you blame the guy, right? I think any of these events would probably, maybe turn somebody to the dark side. When we look at Moses, Moses is regarded as one of, if not the greatest Old Testament prophets that we see in the Bible. So it might be hard to look at Moses as a villain, but I think if we look at Moses in this part of his life that we're going to read this morning in our text, I think we'll see a bit of a villainous side to Moses that will be in need of redemption. Moses was born at a time where the Israelites were living peacefully among the Egyptians. You see, Joseph, who we know is one of the sons of Jacob, we read the story and hear the story of his multicolored coat. He was favored by the Pharaoh. But after Joseph died, a new Pharaoh came into power. And that Pharaoh wanted to enslave the Israelites. He was an enemy of the Israelites, and they fell out of favor with the Pharaoh. And eventually that Pharaoh commanded his people, we read it in Exodus 1:22, that Pharaoh commanded that every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile River, but let every girl live. So this is a little context of what's happening when Moses was born, what's culturally and socially going on in that day. So Moses' mother, she would hide Moses for 3 months. And when she could no longer hide Moses, she ended up putting Moses in a basket. And she set the basket in the Nile River, and Moses floated down the river and was actually found by Pharaoh's daughter. And from our text, it says that she adopted Moses, and Moses actually ended up becoming the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh. And if we look in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 22, Stephen tells us that Moses would be educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in actions. So many years later, when Moses had grown up, that's where we will pick up in our text today. Exodus 2:11 through 25. It reads as thus: Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure nobody was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be prince and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you have killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. And now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water and for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon?" "Today, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered. "And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks." "Then where is he?" the father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." So Moses accepted the invitation, and he settled there with him in time. Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later she gave birth to a son. Moses named him Gershom. And for he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." Years passed and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he looked down on the people of Israel, and he knew it was time to act. And the Lord always adds blessings to the readers, hearers, doers of his word. So as a member of Pharaoh's household, Moses lived a life of privilege, but he was still a Hebrew. So Exodus doesn't tell us how long Moses lived in Pharaoh's household. But if we do some research in the book of Acts again, Stephen tells us that 40 years pass when we pick up in our text. So Moses is 40 years old here, and it says that he went to check on his own people. And he saw how hard they had to work, and he saw the Egyptian beating on one of his fellow Hebrew brothers. Now, in the original Hebrew, this word, when it says Moses saw them or he's seeing them, in the original Hebrew, this means more than just, a visionary thing. This is he sees them with emotion. And that emotion specifically in this text is compassion. So he looked out on their situation and he had compassion on them. It's the same verbiage that we see when God looks out at people and he sees their plight and he sees what they're in need of, and it moves his heart to action. And it's that same type of compassion. You see, I believe that there are 2 types of people in our society when it comes to solving issues, social issues. You have people that have the resources, they have the influence, they have the power, they have those circles that they can make the change necessary, but they just don't care enough, or they don't have time, or maybe they're indifferent or ignorant to the situation. On the other side, you have people who care really deeply about these situations and these issues, and they want to help change the issue, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the power, they don't have the influence to make the change necessary. You see, one thing I love about God, one thing I love about our God is he's in the middle of that, right? He has the power and he cares. And that's where we have action. God always wants to move and have that compassion and that action. And he has the power and the resources. If we look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26, it tells us some of what was going on in the heart of Moses at that time. It says that by faith, Moses deliberately decided to identify with the people of Israel rather than his Egyptian prestige and his Egyptian power and influence. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. You see, Moses saw his people's problems, and his heart was overwhelmed with compassion for them. And he sees this Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews, and he does something that I believe sends him on that path to villainy. He kills this man. And I know that God hadn't given down the top 10 list of the top 10 of the 10 commandments yet, but murder is never okay. Murder wasn't even okay back then. Just because Moses did it, it wasn't without consequence, and we'll get to that later. But Moses kills this man. I'm reminded of Anakin Skywalker with the story I shared earlier when he wanted to avenge his mother. He ended up taking those Tusken Raiders' life. Anakin gives into his emotions and he kills them. And this was instrumental in Anakin's path to the dark side. You see, Moses wasn't without consequence. Being brought up in Pharaoh's household didn't give Moses immunity for this murder. And actually, our text tells us that Pharaoh wanted to kill Moses. He tried to kill Moses for what he had done because Moses became a murderer. Moses even did this crime with intent. Like it says in detail that he dug a grave for the guy in the sand. He looked around to make sure nobody was looking at him. And it said he buried him. See, Moses apparently thought maybe he was being slick about this, but he forgot that there was a witness, and it was the person he saved. That had to have been a real crusher for Moses, being in a situation where you just want to help people, and those same people reject you. So Moses runs from the murder charge. He flees to the desert of Midian, where he meets Zipporah, the daughter of the shepherd, daughter of Jethro, and they have kids and raise a family. Moses has alienated himself economically as his privileged lifestyle ended when he committed this murder. Moses alienates himself from his people, his Jewish brethren, and Moses alienates himself from his culture, becoming an enemy and the fugitive of the Pharaoh. So we see Moses become a villain to his Hebrew people. Moses becomes a villain to the Pharaoh, and Moses, I think in this moment, becomes a villain to himself because he flees for his life. And he probably felt that God's plan for his life was completely defeated. It was completely over at this point. He probably believed that every chance he would ever have to deliver the children of Israel, to deliver his brethren and his sisters from the grasp of Pharaoh at that moment, because he made this decision to kill this man, he became the villain. He probably thought that his plan, God's plan for him, was over. What Moses didn't see, but what we can see, is that God had a plan for Moses. That God had a plan for Moses. Moses was right where God wanted him to be because God wanted Moses. He might have been wanted by the Pharaoh, but he was wanted more by God, even in spite of what he had done. So you're here watching online today, and God has you right where he wants you. You might think that you should be further along, or in our wisdom and in our thinking, our planning and our expectations with the experiences that we've had, whether they're good or whether they're bad. God has us right where he wants us to be because he wants us. That's the key. He wants us. He has a heart for us, and God loves us. You see, some of us have been discouraged. Some of us have given up because we feel like we're not fulfilling a certain purpose. Some of us have been discouraged. Some of us, because we used our giftings in a situation, and maybe that situation didn't turn out how we thought it should have turned out, or maybe that situation turned out great, And it just became this big snowball effect of greatness, and it just became overwhelming. And it in that sense, it like choked you out too, and it was just too much. Maybe some of us have run away to Midian because of some past hurt, some situations, some real life traumas that have happened to us in our experiences. And maybe those experiences have made us reluctant to use our giftings again for the Lord's glory. We've let doubt, we've let reluctance, we've let rejection send us on what we think is a different path. Some of us are in Midian, and while we might think that Midian is our different path in life, I'm here to let you know that God is still with us even in Midian. God is with us in Midian, strengthening us. He's with us in Midian, sharpening us, correcting us, loving us, protecting us, providing for us. Listen, your giftings are there. They're there. And when God says it's time, all you have to do is be like Moses and say, doesn't matter about the past, here I am. Here I am, God. Redeem me. You see, God used Moses in spite of his villainy, in spite of his imperfections. Your experiences are not always going to be perfect. Moses killed a man. Moses ran. Moses made every excuse in the book why he couldn't do what God had called him to do. Moses could speak the best according to him. Moses got angry. Moses even argued with God. Moses even would miss out on the promised land, and that's that natural consequences that I kind of talked about too, where just because you have redemption doesn't mean that you're removed from natural consequence. But it was about God and his covenant that he made with Israel, and God, being faithful to his promise, chose to use Moses in spite of what his villainy was. So God can use anybody that he chooses. That's what I want you to hear today, that God can use anybody that he chooses. And that's good news for us, because that lets me know and that lets you know that God doesn't need our perfection. God wants our willingness. He doesn't need our perfection. He has Jesus for that. Jesus has got that thing covered. He's the only begotten of the Father, perfect, and redeemed us. So he's got that covered. He just needs us to be willing. God uses us in spite of our imperfections, in spite of our weaknesses, because God can use anybody for any purpose. I love to grill. I love to barbecue. And I got this seasoning that I created that I just put a bunch of different spices together, kind of like a seasoned all rib rub. And, you sprinkle it on the meat, put the meat in the oven, and then from what I hear, people tell me it's good. I'm not tooting my own horn. I wish that God somehow had like some type of season all that when we laid down at night, he could just sprinkle experience and sprinkle giftings and just sprinkle all the things that we need, all the tools we need for this life. I wish it was that easy, and then we just wake up and we're good to go, just on fire for God, and then just rolling. I wish that's how it worked, but that's not how it works. This thing is a journey. It's not an overnight process. It's not that overnight process, and we can't let our experiences move us away from God, because those experiences it's the seasoning. Those experiences are the seasoning. So we can't let those experiences move us away from God. Let's let those experiences move us closer to God. Moses' giftings, the characteristics, the thing that made Moses such a powerful leader didn't just develop in him overnight. The experiences that he went through, the 40 years that he was in Jethro's household being a shepherd. Like for 40 years, God was grooming and shaping and sharpening Moses. The giftings were there, but Moses needed a little bit more seasoning. As a prophet, Moses would become God's representative to the people of Israel. So whenever they had any disputes, Moses actually became a judge over the people. We have the benefit of hindsight. So if you go back and look at in the text what the Hebrew brethren said to Moses, who made you a judge or a prince over us? The ironic thing, we can kind of look back and we can see like Moses always had those giftings. He just needed more seasoning, as I said. Who made you a judge? Well, God did. Just wasn't time for Moses to be acting on his own and in his own plan and his own will. Moses had the giftings and the characteristics needed. And God taught him so much more when he spent the better part of 40 years learning as being a shepherd, supporting, raising a family in this time. You know, these are not insignificant things. While we might think that we might have these mountaintop experiences with God, and we do, and they're good, but there are also experiences that we're going to have that are in the valley. Most of life is lived in the valley. The everyday, mundane, going to work, raising your family, the everyday things that we do. We can't forget that God is also with us in those times. He's often with us most in the valley. The small things of life is where God prepares us for his call. The next season of our life, I think somebody's ready for today, because some of us have been in the valley too long. Some of us have been in Midian for too long, and we're ready to come out. I know rejection doesn't feel good, and that might be why we went to Midian. I know fear can be scary, and reluctance and self-doubt and those things that maybe drove us to Midian are different experiences that drove us into the valley, but God is just seasoning you for something greater. God is just seasoning you for something greater. You see, Moses would go on to be arguably the greatest prophet in the Old Testament. But Moses' actions weren't without consequences. As I said, redemption doesn't mean that you're free from those consequences. Moses should have been killed, and Moses was on the run for the next 40 years. And those 40 years, man, they were filled with hard, outdoor, manual labor, the complete opposite of what Moses was used to growing up in Pharaoh's home. He had it easy for 40 years, and then he had it the hardest he ever had it for 40 years. God would later, in Moses' life, appoint Moses to speak for him, to be his mouthpiece, first to Pharaoh and then to the Israelites. God would give Moses the top 10 list, his 10 commandments. Moses met with God face to face. And even though Moses never set foot in the promised land during his lifetime, more consequences for his actions, as I said, he has given him the opportunity to enter the promised land. If we look at the New Testament in the Gospels, where he is on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, and Moses is there and Elijah is there. God can and will use you. If we look at the last verse of our text, it says that God turned his attention to Israel because of the covenant that he made with them. God gives his love and his attention to us also in that same way, but not because of the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, but because of the covenant that he made through his son, Jesus Christ. So there are two things I want to leave with you today. I want you to think about your circle, or think about your job, or the places that you frequent. And I want you to do like Moses did. In the heart of God, see somebody, but not just with your eyes, with your heart. Try to look at somebody and have compassion on their situation sometime this week. There are many different ways you can do that. Just be led by the Spirit and see where God leads you with that. Number two, I want us to stop thinking that there are parts of our story that God can't redeem. There is nothing that is beyond the redemptive power of Jesus Christ. There's work that we have to do on our end. There might be some consequences that we have to have on our end. But Jesus did his part already. Jesus did his part already. Forgive yourself for maybe being the villain in your own story. Do the work. Maybe it's stepping back into your giftings. With boldness and not reluctance. Maybe it's you tried this thing and you would rather stay in Midian because it's comfortable. Maybe you'd rather stay in the valley because it's comfortable. But God wanted Moses, and just like he wanted Moses, God wants you today. You don't have to be perfect. All you have to do is just be willing. We as people, sometimes we make plans. They make sense from our perspective. Yet God's plan can and will be like radically different at times for us. And it's not by mistake that you're listening this morning. It's the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. And all you have to do is say, "Here I am," just like Moses did.